The hall of Ithaca was quiet beneath the moon. Its columns, pale and ancient, stood like trees turned to stone. Between them, the air moved with the faintest sigh of the sea. Somewhere below the cliffs, the water broke upon the rocks. Not a crash, but a long exhalation. The same sound that had filled these nights for 20 years. Penelope sat before the loom. The wool lay across her knees, white as salt foam. In the lamplight, each thread gleamed, a single captured wave. Her fingers found the shuttle by instinct. The rhythm was older than thought. A heartbeat rendered in wood and fiber. It was the rhythm that had carried her through the empty years. She no longer counted the days. The world outside the hall might turn or freeze. The stars might shift their courses. None of it reached her. What mattered was this: the meeting of thread and thread. The whisper of the loom. The quiet conversation between hand and heart. Sometimes she imagined the loom was alive. It breathed when she did. Its frame, smooth from her touch, seemed to lean forward, as if listening for her thoughts. When the shuttle moved, the wood sang, a low tone. Half music, half memory. And through that song she felt him. The one who had gone to sea. The servants slept. Telemachus had long since taken to his chamber. Only the wind remained awake, creeping through the shutters with the smell of olive leaves and night. It lifted the edge of her veil, and for a moment she thought she heard footsteps. But it was only the sea again, climbing the rocks, falling back, climbing once more. Her eyes stung from the lamplight, yet she could not bring herself to stop. To stop would be to let silence win. So she wove patterns of patience, lines of longing, the ghost of a story she would never tell aloud. Once, in the first winters after he sailed, she had wept as she worked. Tears had darkened the wool, and the thread had tangled beneath her hands. Now she no longer cried. Her sorrow had grown quiet, woven into the cloth itself. She remembered the morning he left, the flash of bronze at his shoulder, the promise spoken with a smile too confident to believe. He had kissed her once, gently, and said he would return before the boy could speak his name. That boy was now a man, and the sea had never yielded its truth. The loom whispered again, and she drew the shuttle through the threads. In that moment, she saw him not as the hero sung by bards, but as the man who had once watched her weave by daylight. His chin resting on his hand, the scent of oil and seaweed still clinging to him. She had laughed then, telling him that weaving was a dull art compared to war. He had answered, "Perhaps, but a good thread holds longer than a spear." Quote, she smiled at the memory, small and sudden. It faded as quickly as it came, leaving behind only the soft echo of his voice. The candles guttered. Their light flickered against the walls, revealing the faces carved into the beams. Gods and beasts, guardians of this waiting. The shadows stretched and merged, and she thought they too were tired of the years. Outside, a night bird called. Its note fell through the silence like a stone into still water. Ripples of sound reached her ears, and then were gone. She leaned closer to her work. Each thread seemed endless, a road without a destination. She wondered whether the gods themselves had woven the world in such a pattern. 1,000 crossings, 1,000 partings, each life a fragile strand. Sometimes, when the nights were longest, she imagined unmaking it all. To pull the thread, to let it unravel, to watch the world loosen and drift apart like mist. But even in those thoughts there was no anger, only the slow ache of weariness. The act of weaving had become her breathing. To stop would be to forget how to live. The lamp hissed softly as the oil sank lower. She rose and poured more from the small clay jar. The scent of olive filled the air, fresh and sharp. The flame steadied, and the room glowed once more with that amber warmth that could almost be mistaken for dawn. She paused to rest her hands, watching the cloth she had made. It spilled across the floor in pale folds, a sea caught in moonlight. Here was time itself, captured. Hour after hour pressed into the weave. She thought of the other women of Ithaca, asleep beside their husbands. Sometimes she envied them their certainty, their small, known lives. But then she remembered the stories told by sailors, how they spoke of sirens and storms, of gods who toyed with men as easily as she toyed with thread. Perhaps certainty was only another kind of prison. Her gaze wandered to the window. The moon hung low over the sea, a thin, patient watcher. Its light touched the loom, the wool, her face. It made of everything a single color, silver and stillness. Penelope breathed in that light, and in the quiet she whispered, "Let him be safe, wherever he drifts." Quote, no answer came, of course. Only the sound of the loom continuing its endless conversation. Pause in narration if reading aloud. As the night deepened, her thoughts turned to the shape of time. Days were no longer counted by sun or star, but by the growing weight of the cloth. Every thread was a moment survived, every pattern a memory secured against forgetting. Sometimes she wondered if he too felt the loom's rhythm across the sea, if some echo of her patience reached him through the dark waters, guiding his ship as the North Star guides a lost bird. The air grew cooler. From the corridor came a faint creak, as though the house itself shifted in sleep. She pulled a shawl around her shoulders, fingers tracing the rough weave. It was work she had done in the early years. Uneven, hurried, her skill had grown since then, and so had her silence. Her mother-in-law had once told her that patience was the virtue of stones. Penelope thought perhaps it was truer of threads. They held together not by strength, but by persistence. The first glimmer of dawn had not yet touched the horizon, but the air hinted at its coming. She could feel it in her skin, that tremor before the sky softens. And so she slowed the loom, each movement gentler, each breath longer. Her eyes half closed, she let the world blur into sound and light. The shuttle moved like a pendulum of sleep, and the cloth beneath her hands seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the sea. The sound folded into itself, a lullaby woven from endurance. Somewhere within that rhythm, she thought she heard another heartbeat, steady and far away, perhaps real, perhaps remembered. Penelope leaned back, her hair slipped loose over her shoulder. The loom waited, the thread taut between them. She watched the flame tremble once, twice, and then the first thin light of morning entered through the shutters, pale as breath. The vigil would begin again tomorrow, as it always had, as it always would, until the sea chose to return what it had taken. For now, she rested, her eyes closed, her hands still holding the thread. The hall of Ithaca lay hushed around her, and the whisper of the loom faded slowly into the hum of dawn. Dawn arrived softly, not in gold but in a thin gray breath that touched the corners of the hall. The lamps had guttered out. A faint chill threaded through the stones, carrying with it the smell of wet earth from the courtyard. Penelope stirred. Her fingers, still resting on the loom, felt the coolness of the air before her eyes opened. The cloth before her glowed faintly in the new light, a pale horizon caught in wool. For a long while she did not move. The world seemed suspended between sleep and waking, and she wished, almost childishly, that it might stay there. The stillness of that moment was perfect. Even the sea below the cliffs seemed to hold its breath. She rose at last, her limbs stiff from hours of stillness. The hem of her gown whispered across the floor as she crossed to the window. Outside, Ithaca lay draped in morning mist. Olive groves muted to silver, the harbor veiled in cloud. She could just make out the masts of ships rocking at anchor, the slow motion of gulls above them. She remembered standing here in younger years, watching those same sails depart, each one a promise, each one a farewell. Some had returned, most had not. She wondered whether hope, too, had a harbor somewhere beyond sight, or whether it drifted endlessly like the tide. Behind her, the loom waited. Its threads caught the thin daylight and shimmered faintly. She turned back to it, smiling with a tenderness that surprised her. The loom had become a companion more constant than any living voice. It had listened to every thought unspoken, every prayer that never found words. She touched the cloth once more. The pattern had grown complex, layers upon layers of careful design. She could trace, within its shifting geometry, the story of her waiting, the winters of fear, the summers of endurance. Each color had meaning. The deep blue of night, the white of empty mornings, the faint ochre of the hearth's dying coals. The servants would wake soon, and the household would return to its daily rhythm. But these early hours belonged only to her. They were a secret gift from time itself, offered to those who kept vigil. She sat again and gathered the thread. The new day's weaving began not with haste, but with a sigh. The shuttle moved slower now, its song softened by dawn. As she worked, her mind drifted to Telemachus. He had his father's eyes, clear and questioning. Yet he did not speak of the sea as Odysseus once had. His world was bound to this island, to the duties that had fallen upon him. Penelope loved him fiercely, but sometimes she saw in his silence a mirror of her own, an inheritance of waiting. She wondered if the gods were cruel to make patience hereditary. A voice called from the corridor, Eurinum, her oldest servant. The woman entered quietly, carrying a basin of water and a folded cloth. "My lady," she whispered, bowing her head. "Shall I bring bread?" Later, Penelope said gently. "When the sun is higher." Eurinum glanced at the loom, her eyes soft with understanding. "You have been awake all night again." Penelope smiled. "The night keeps me company." The servant hesitated as if wanting to say more, then left. Footsteps faded. The hall returned to stillness. Penelope dipped her hands in the cool water. The touch of it startled her. Real, immediate, alive. She watched the ripples settle before drying her fingers and taking up the shuttle once more. The rhythm resumed. Shush, clack, shush, clack. Outside, the first true light spilled across the sea. It reached the walls of the hall, sliding up the columns, setting the dust aglow like drifting pollen. She worked within that halo, and for a time it seemed that light and thread were the same substance. Hours passed unnoticed. The pattern grew, line upon line, until the fabric seemed to breathe. Her body moved automatically. Her mind wandered. She thought of her youth, the girl she had been before the war, before her name had become a prayer whispered by strangers. That girl had believed in the neatness of stories, in endings that came when they were due. She had not known that some tales lengthened beyond measure, that the truest epics were those without resolution. The sea outside glittered. A ship moved along the horizon, its sail a small white mark against the blue. For an instant, her heart leapt, but it was a trader, not the one she had dreamed of. The old familiar ache returned, gentle now, like the echo of a song long learned. By midday the hall had filled with warmth. Servants came and went, bearing food, sweeping dust, murmuring to one another. Penelope moved among them quietly, neither mistress nor ghost, offering small smiles, small words. When they left, the silence closed around her again like water. The rhythm of the loom changed subtly with the light. Afternoon brought a deeper tone, the wood expanding with heat. Each sound carried a weight, a gravity that seemed to draw her inward. She wove as if descending into herself, thread by thread. Her thoughts grew hazy. The pattern blurred. Her hands moved by memory alone. At times she imagined she could feel the distant pulse of the sea through the floor stones, the same beat that guided the loom, that guided her heart. As the sun began its slow descent, she paused. The day had passed unnoticed, swallowed by the steady tide of motion. She looked down at her work, an expanse of pale cloth glinting faintly in the golden light. The edges shimmered where the threads were still loose, as though they wished to return to raw wool and wind. She rose and stepped back. Her shoulders ached pleasantly, a reminder that the body, too, was part of the craft. From the open window came the scent of thyme and sea salt. She inhaled deeply. For the first time in many hours, she allowed herself to think of evening, not as another vigil to endure, but as a friend returning. Night would come, and with it the hush she loved most. The hall would dim, the servants would sleep, and the loom would again become the only heartbeat in the world. She smiled faintly at the thought. And so the day drifted toward dusk, and Penelope, keeper of patience, prepared to begin her vigil anew. Evening gathered at the edges of the island. The sky deepened from gold to violet, and the sea mirrored it like tempered glass. One by one the lamps in the palace were lit, their small flames shivering against the wide dusk. Servants murmured in distant corridors, voices softened by stone and distance. When at last the hall fell quiet again, Penelope returned to the loom. The air had changed. It smelled of cooling earth and olive wood, of lamps newly kindled. She felt the weight of the day slide from her shoulders as she sat. Her hands found the thread as if it had been waiting for them all along. The shuttle began to move. The pattern resumed its breath. Outside, the first stars appeared. They came slowly, one after another, until the sky was strewn with them. Tiny embers cast across a vast, dark cloth. She paused to watch them through the window's lattice. How many nights had she watched that same sky, believing it unchanged while she herself grew older beneath it? She no longer feared the passing of years. Time had become a quiet companion, its footsteps matching hers along the corridor of waiting. The loom creaked softly. She touched its frame as one might touch the shoulder of an old friend. It answered with a low hum, the sound of wood remembering the hands that had shaped it. She thought of her father's hull in faraway Sparta, of the looms there that had sung through her childhood. The same music, the same solace. It seemed that women had always spoken to the world in this language of thread. As the night deepened, her mind wandered again to him. The one the songs called cunning, the one the sea could not destroy. She saw him in her thoughts as clearly as she had that first morning of farewell. The sun flashing on his armor. The curve of his smile when he promised to return. She had believed him then without question. Now she believed because she must. The sea breeze slipped through the shutters. It carried the taste of salt, the faint sound of waves brushing the shore. She closed her eyes and listened. Sometimes the sea seemed to speak. Sometimes it only sighed. In its shifting voice she could almost hear the distant oars of a ship. The creak of its ropes. The breath of men half dreaming on its deck. Perhaps memory itself was made of sea air. Invisible, uncatchable, yet always returning. She wove those thoughts into the cloth. letting imagination become pattern. Here a thread of deep blue for the ocean's heart. There a pale silver for the moon that guided him. The loom kept its steady rhythm, and the world outside the hull fell away. Hours folded quietly into one another. The lamps burned lower, their flames thin to small pearls of light. Shadows reached across the floor like ink spreading on water. Penelope worked until the weave shimmered before her eyes, then set the shuttle down and leaned back. The hull was utterly still. Only the distant murmur of the sea remained. She listened to it as one listens to a familiar song, each rise and fall a line she already knew. Her thoughts drifted inward, to that small and secret place where patience lives. Not the patience of waiting for joy, but the patience of being, of holding one's shape against the currents of time. She thought of the cloth she unmade each dawn, the endless trick that kept her suitors at bay. There was a strange comfort in that deception, for it allowed her to remain both faithful and free. By day she was queen. By night she was only a woman with her thread, undoing the day's false promises, and returning to the quiet truth of the loom. The lamp beside her guttered once. Its wick bent and righted itself. The flame flared, then steadied. She reached to trim it with a pin, and the sudden scent of burning linen filled the air. It reminded her of his cloak, scorched by the sun and salt. For a moment, her heart gave a single, startled beat. As if he stood behind her. As if his shadow had crossed the threshold. But there was only the loom, and the quiet turning of the night. The moon climbed high. Its light lay across the floor in a pale, unbroken stripe. Penelope followed it with her eyes until it reached her bare feet. The light was cold, but beautiful. She felt herself dissolve within it, a figure drawn of breath and patience, woven from nothing but endurance. She rose and walked to the open window. Below, the sea gleamed like metal under the stars. The wind pressed against her face. She closed her eyes and let it pass through her hair. In that moment, she imagined the island asleep behind her, each life a small flame protected by stone and silence. She alone remained awake to guard them all. Turning back to the loom, she saw that the cloth caught the moonlight and shimmered faintly, as though the threads had turned to water. She smiled, and for the first time that day she whispered aloud. Not to any god, not even to him, but to the night itself. Keep the sea kind, keep the stars steady, and if he dreams of home, let him wake to its scent. Quote, her words vanished into the rafters. Still, she felt lighter for having spoken them. She returned to her seat and began once more to weave. The sound rose softly, a heartbeat, a lullaby, a secret prayer. The hull breathed with her. Outside, the sea answered with its endless refrain. At last, near midnight, her hands slowed. The threads blurred before her eyes. The candlelight turned them to waves. She laid the shuttle down and rested her palms upon the cloth. It was warm from her touch, alive with the labor of the hours. The world narrowed to that single point, the meeting of her skin and the weave. In it was everything she had lived. The first cry of her child, the long years of rumor and silence, the weary kindness of those who waited with her, all of it bound together, not by hope alone, but by the quiet faith that endurance is its own form of love. She leaned forward, whispering almost to herself, the loom remembers. Even if I forget, the loom will remember. Then she drew the cloth over her lap like a blanket, rested her head against the frame, and closed her eyes. Outside, the sea turned silver under the moon.